It started as an ordinary evening, the kind where everything feels calm, and life seems to hum along as it should. I was in the living room, scrolling through my phone, half distracted by the TV playing in the background. My stepson, Ryan, who's usually reserved, walked in and stood there for a moment, almost hesitating. I glanced up and smiled at him, expecting him to casually ask for something or maybe just give me a quick update about his day. But instead, he said something that immediately made me pause. "Can we talk? Just you and me?" His tone was serious, too serious for a teenager who usually spoke in half sentences and shrugged more than he used words. It caught me off guard. I mean, Ryan and I had a good relationship, but we weren't the kind to sit down and have heart-to-hearts very often. He was more comfortable around his mom, and I tried to respect that. Still, the look in his eyes made it clear this wasn't something I could brush off. "Of course," I replied, setting my phone aside. "What's up?" He glanced over his shoulder as if making sure no one else was around, then quietly said, "Not here." "Can we go somewhere else?" At that moment, my mind raced with questions. What could be so private that he didn't want his mom to overhear? Was he in some kind of trouble? Did something happen at school? The possibilities were endless, and none of them felt particularly comforting. I followed him to the back porch, where the air was cool and the night was quiet except for the distant hum of crickets. He sat down on the steps and I joined him, waiting for him to start. Ryan fidgeted with his hands for a moment before finally speaking. What came out of his mouth next completely shattered the quiet evening I thought I was having. And that's where things took a turn I never expected. Ryan's voice was low, barely above a whisper, as he finally started to speak. "I don't know how to say this," he began, his eyes fixed on the ground. "But I think something's going on, and I don't know what to do." I stayed quiet, not wanting to push him too hard. I could tell he was struggling to get the words out, and the last thing I wanted was to make him feel uncomfortable or rushed. Still, my heart was pounding. His tone, his body language, it all felt heavy. Like he was carrying some secret that was too big for him to handle alone. After a long pause, he looked up at me, his eyes a mix of fear and uncertainty. "Have you ever felt like someone isn't who you thought they were?" The question threw me. I didn't know where he was going with this, but it was clear he wasn't just talking about a casual misunderstanding. "What do you mean?" I asked gently, trying to piece together what he was hinting at without scaring him off. Ryan bit his lip, his hands nervously rubbing the knees of his jeans. "I don't know if I can trust," he stopped mid-sentence, shaking his head. "Never mind. Maybe I'm just overthinking." "No," I said firmly but calmly. "You can talk to me. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." I meant it, but even as I said the words, I felt a knot in my stomach. What could possibly have him this shaken? He hesitated again, then finally said, "It's about Mom." Hearing those words hit me like a freight train. His mom, my wife, was the anchor of our family. The thought that there could be something going on with her, something Ryan felt he couldn't even say out loud, made my mind spiral. Was she sick? Was there some trouble she hadn't shared with me? But before I could ask, Ryan added quickly, "It's not just her. It's someone else too. Someone she knows." I stared at him, trying to keep my expression steady. Inside, I was anything but calm. "What do you mean? Is she okay?" Ryan looked away again, as though he wasn't sure how to explain. "I don't know how to say it," he admitted. "I just feel like something's off. And I don't know if I'm crazy for thinking it, or if I'm the only one who sees it." The tension in the air was thick, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night breeze. Whatever this was, it was big. But I didn't push him further. Not yet. The weight of Ryan's words hung in the air, and I could see he was struggling to say more. I wanted to ask him 1,000 questions, to make sense of what he was trying to tell me, but I knew I had to let him set the pace. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The night felt quieter than ever, like even the world was holding its breath. Finally, Ryan spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's this guy. I don't know who he is, but I've seen him. A couple of times. Around Mom." His words made my heart sink. "Seen him where?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Once at the store, and another time, here. At the house." My mind raced. At the house? When? Why hadn't I noticed anything? A surge of protectiveness bubbled up inside me, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. "Are you sure? Maybe he's just someone she knows, like a coworker or an old friend." Ryan shook his head, his jaw tightening. "No. It's not like that." The way they were talking, it was different. He paused, staring out into the dark yard. It just didn't feel right. And she didn't even tell me who he was. She acted like it wasn't a big deal, but it felt like she was hiding something. I couldn't ignore the pit forming in my stomach. This wasn't like Ryan. He wasn't the type to make something out of nothing. If he was coming to me with this, it meant he truly believed something was wrong. "When was the last time you saw him?" I asked carefully. Ryan hesitated. "A few days ago. I was in my room, and I heard voices outside. I looked out the window, and he was in the driveway, talking to her. When I asked her about it later, she just said it wasn't important. But it didn't feel that way to me. I didn't know what to think. On one hand, it could all be a misunderstanding, an innocent explanation buried under teenage assumptions. But on the other hand, Ryan's instincts were hard to dismiss. "Ryan, if you see him again, or if anything else happens, you have to tell me right away," I said, my voice firm but calm. "I will," he replied, though his tone carried more doubt than reassurance. And in that moment, I realized we were both standing on the edge of something we didn't fully understand. The next few days felt like walking on eggshells. Every glance from Ryan seemed heavier, every conversation with my wife felt slightly off. I kept telling myself that there had to be an explanation, something harmless that I hadn't considered yet. But as much as I tried to brush it off, Ryan's words lingered in the back of my mind like a bad song on repeat. Then, one evening, things took a turn I couldn't ignore. I came home a little earlier than usual, the kind of rare day where traffic magically cleared up. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed another car parked just down the street. At first glance, it didn't seem out of place, just a dark sedan sitting there, its windows tinted. But then I realized it wasn't a neighbor's car. I stayed in my car for a moment, staring at it, my stomach churning with unease. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it belonged to someone visiting a neighbor. But then I saw movement inside the car, a faint silhouette of someone sitting there, motionless, watching. A chill ran down my spine. I got out of the car and made my way to the house, my steps slower than usual as I kept glancing over my shoulder. By the time I reached the door, the sedan had pulled away, disappearing around the corner. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound casual. In here, my wife's voice responded from the kitchen. I walked in to find her standing by the counter, a glass of wine in her hand. She smiled, but there was something about it that felt forced, like she was trying too hard to seem normal. "You're home early," she said, her tone light but almost rehearsed. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my eyes on her. Traffic was good. I wanted to ask her about the car, about the man Ryan had mentioned, about everything that was clawing at my thoughts. But before I could, Ryan walked into the room. He stopped abruptly, glancing between the two of us like he'd interrupted something. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. My wife's smile faltered for just a second, but it was enough for me to notice. And then Ryan, his voice shaking just slightly, said, "Dad, he's outside." My heart sank the moment Ryan said those words, "Dad, he's outside." I froze, my mind racing. Who was outside? The man he'd seen before? The same one in the car? My wife's expression shifted, barely perceptible, but enough to confirm she knew exactly what Ryan was talking about. Her eyes darted toward the window, and for the first time, I saw something in her face I hadn't expected: fear. I moved to the window, pushing the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The driveway was empty, but further down the street, parked near the corner, was the same dark sedan I'd seen earlier. This time, the headlights were off, and the car sat like a shadow, blending into the night. "Who is that?" I asked, my voice low but sharp, my eyes shifting to my wife. She hesitated, her grip tightening on the wine glass until her knuckles turned white. I don't know, she said, but her tone wavered, betraying her. Ryan stepped closer, his voice more urgent now. "He was here before. I told you. Why won't anyone listen to me?" "Ryan, stay here," I said firmly, my pulse pounding in my ears as I headed for the door. "Wait," my wife called out, her voice trembling. "Don't go out there." I stopped in my tracks, turning back to face her. "Why not? Who is he? What's going on, Rachel?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her eyes darted to Ryan, then back to me, and I could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. Before she could say anything, there was a knock at the door, 3 sharp, deliberate raps that echoed through the silence like a gunshot. The 3 of us froze, staring at the door. The sound of it seemed to charge the air with electricity, and I could feel the tension thickening around us. Ryan moved closer to me, his voice barely audible. "Don't open it." But I couldn't just stand there. I had to know who it was. Slowly, I walked to the door, my hand hovering over the handle as every instinct screamed at me to stop. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steady despite the fear twisting in my chest. There was no response. Just silence. I turned back to my wife, but before I could say anything, she blurted out, "Don't answer it." Her words stopped me cold. "What are you not telling me?" I demanded, my frustration boiling over. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's complicated," she said, her voice breaking. Before I could press her further, the knocking came again, this time louder, more insistent. My hands balled into fists as I turned back to the door. And then, from the other side, came a voice. Low, calm, and eerily familiar. "We need to talk." My hand hovered over the door handle as the voice on the other side sent a chill down my spine. "We need to talk." It was calm but laced with an authority that made my stomach tighten. I turned to Rachel, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the counter behind her. Ryan stood frozen, his wide eyes locked on me, silently pleading for me not to open the door. But I couldn't ignore it any longer. The fear, the secrecy, the tension, it had to end. I unlocked the door and swung it open, bracing myself for what, or who, I would find. Standing there was a man in his early 40s, dressed in a dark coat that matched the ominous sedan I'd seen earlier. His face was sharp, his expression unreadable. He looked past me, his gaze landing directly on Rachel. "Hello, Rachel," he said, his tone unsettlingly familiar. Rachel's breath hitched, and she finally spoke, her voice shaky. "What are you doing here?" "I think you know," he replied, stepping forward. I blocked the doorway, my pulse racing. "You're not coming in until you explain who you are and what's going on," I said firmly. The man smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Mark. Rachel and we have some history." History. The word hung in the air like a thundercloud. I turned to Rachel, my voice rising. "What is he talking about?" Rachel looked at me, tears streaming down her face. "I was going to tell you. I just didn't know how." Mark cut in, his tone dripping with bitterness. "Tell him what? That we used to be married? That you left without a word and started a new life?" My head spun. Married? She had never mentioned anything about this part of her past. Is that true? I asked, my voice barely steady. Rachel nodded, her voice breaking. It was years ago, before I met you. I left because it wasn't safe. He wasn't safe. Mark's expression darkened. Careful, Rachel. You're not the victim here. And just as the tension reached its breaking point, Ryan stepped forward, his voice trembling but strong. I saw you, he said, looking at Mark. You've been following us, haven't you? Mark's smile vanished. I came to talk, he said, his tone colder now. But Ryan wasn't backing down. You don't scare me, he said, his eyes blazing with determination. The moment hung heavy, and just as I thought it might escalate further, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Rachel let out a shaky breath. I called the police, she whispered. Mark's jaw clenched, and without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, disappearing into the night. As the flashing lights filled the driveway, I looked at Rachel, my voice quiet but firm. No more secrets. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. As the police car pulled into the driveway, its red and blue lights flashing against the darkened street, a wave of relief washed over me, but it was mixed with exhaustion. Rachel let out a shaky sigh and leaned against the counter, her hands still trembling. Ryan stood silently, his shoulders tense, watching as the officers stepped out to survey the situation. Mark was gone, his car disappearing into the shadows, but I knew this wasn't something that would just fade away. The officers took statements from all of us, their voices calm and reassuring as they asked questions. Rachel was hesitant at first, but when she finally started to explain, the full weight of her story came crashing down. She had left Mark years ago, escaping an abusive marriage that she had kept hidden from everyone, even me. She admitted that she had wanted to tell me the truth but feared it would bring everything back into her life. For a long time, she believed she had left that chapter behind. But when Mark found her again, everything she had worked so hard to rebuild began to crumble. Listening to her, I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and a fierce sense of protectiveness. I wished she had trusted me enough to share this sooner, but I also couldn't imagine the fear she must have carried all this time. Ryan, for his part, stayed remarkably strong. He admitted he had been suspicious for weeks, seeing Mark around and noticing his mom's nervous behavior. I didn't know what to do, he said quietly, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. The officers assured us they would follow up and issued a restraining order against Mark. They promised to keep a close watch on the area, but even with their reassurances, I knew we couldn't just go back to normal. This experience had left a mark on all of us. Later that night, as the house finally grew quiet, the three of us sat together in the living room. For the first time in weeks, Rachel looked at me and Ryan with something close to peace in her eyes. I'm sorry for everything, she said softly. I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. We'll get through this. Together. Ryan leaned in, his voice steady. We're a team now, right? I nodded, pulling him and Rachel closer. Always. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, we faced it together, with no more secrets. And somehow, that felt like the first step toward real healing.